They didn't wear horns, they didn't fight for glory, and they didn't fear death. When the sun went down, the dark Vikings came out, men who believed pain was sacred and terror was a weapon. Villages didn't fall because of swords alone, they fell because of what survivors whispered afterward. Bodies left displayed, rituals performed in silence, screams offered to the gods instead of prayers. Some captives begged to be killed quickly, but mercy was not part of the ritual. What you were about to witness was meant to last longer than death itself. History calls them warriors, explorers, heroes. But tonight, you will hear the side of the Vikings that even their own sagas were afraid to write down.
The night the palace spoke. They were taught that silence meant safety. They were taught that obedience meant survival. But on this night, the palace broke its own rules. The night air inside the imperial palace was heavy with heat and oil smoke, the kind that clung to skin and made breathing feel deliberate, almost laborious. Lamps burned low along the corridors, their flames trembling against stone walls that had not felt the touch of sunlight in centuries. When Issa was shaken awake, it was not violent, but it was final. Hands closed around her arms with practiced certainty, neither cruel nor gentle, just inevitable. She was 20 years old, taken from her Circassian village at 12, sold in Cairo, shipped across the sea, and trained for 8 years to exist quietly inside these walls. In all that time, she had never seen the city beyond the palace gates. She had never needed to. The palace was the world, and tonight the world was ending. She dressed without being told how, her body moving ahead of thought, because training had long ago replaced instinct. In the corridor outside her chamber, women were already gathering, dozens of them, barefoot on cold tiles, their silk robes hastily tied, hair loose or half-braided from sleep. No one spoke. They did not need to. The sound of breathing was enough, uneven and shallow, as if the hallway itself were listening. Issa recognized faces in the flickering light, girls who sang, women who had borne children, others who had served for decades and survived long enough to fade into the background of palace life. Survival had never required courage here, it required invisibility. They were guided forward by eunuchs whose faces betrayed nothing. These men had escorted them to baths, to lessons, to celebrations. Tonight, their expressions were carved from stone. The procession moved through passageways scented with rosewater and old dust, toward a courtyard Issa had seen only once before, in daylight, during a ceremonial transfer. That memory did not belong to this moment. This was the middle of the night. Ceremony did not happen in darkness.
The courtyard opened suddenly, wide and exposed to the sky, and Issa felt the shift immediately. Canvas sacks were piled against one wall, too many to count at first glance. Thick rope lay coiled beside them. Stones were stacked carefully, each one smooth, heavy, and unmistakably chosen. The order of it all was what struck her most. Nothing here was rushed, nothing was improvised. This was preparation, not punishment. The realization moved through the women like a silent wave, bending spines, tightening throats. Some began to cry softly. Others froze, still clinging to disbelief, because belief was unbearable. At the far end of the courtyard stood the chief eunuch, the man who controlled every threshold of the harem, the man whose approval decided which women rose and which disappeared. In his hands were a needle and thick thread, tools as ordinary as they were terrifying. He was not angry, he was not pleased, he was performing a duty. Issa understood then why no accusations had been spoken, why no charges had been read. This was not justice, it was maintenance. Before the first sack was sewn shut, before the ropes were lifted and the stones placed, history had already decided how this night would be remembered. It would not be remembered at all. What was about to happen would leave no records, no graves, no names. The water would take the evidence, the palace would absorb the silence, and the empire would continue, untroubled by the knowledge of what it required to stay whole. But this night did not begin in madness, and it did not belong to one man alone. It was the final movement of a system built over generations, a system that turned fear into law and obedience into currency. To understand why these women were standing barefoot before sacks and stones, you must go back to the rules that governed power, to the cage that shaped a ruler's mind, and to a belief so deeply rooted that cruelty came to feel like necessity. Because what happened in this courtyard was not the beginning of the horror, it was the moment it revealed itself.
The system that never needed mercy. This was not a secret born of madness. It was tradition, refined over centuries, and once it began, no one inside it was innocent. Long before that night in the courtyard, before sacks were sewn and stones chosen by hand, the fate of women inside the imperial palace had already been decided by law, custom, and fear. The Ottoman Harem was not a place of indulgence accidentally corrupted by cruelty. It was a carefully engineered institution designed to protect power at any cost. Every corridor, every rule, every silence served a single purpose: ensuring the survival of the dynasty. Human lives were simply materials in that design. Girls did not arrive as individuals, they arrived as potential. Governors sent them as gifts to earn favor. Traders sold them as investments. Families surrendered them during famine, believing palace walls meant safety. By the time they reached the capital, their pasts had already been erased. New names replaced old ones. New languages replaced their mother tongues. Even memory became dangerous. To survive, a girl learned quickly that who she had been no longer mattered. Only who she might become did. The harem divided women with ruthless efficiency. Those judged unremarkable were assigned to service, spending lives laundering silk, scrubbing marble, and aging into invisibility. Those deemed beautiful entered a different world entirely. They were educated relentlessly, trained in music, poetry, etiquette, and obedience. Their days were measured in lessons and inspections, their nights in whispered hopes. Everything they learned was designed to make them pleasing, not powerful. Power was never promised, it was something stolen if luck and timing allowed. But beauty alone meant nothing without the Sultan's attention, and attention was a double-edged blade. Favor elevated a woman overnight, granting private chambers, servants, and income beyond imagination. Yet the same favor marked her as a target. Inside the harem, success created enemies faster than failure. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Every birth reshaped alliances. A son could raise a woman to the highest rank in the empire, or sign her death warrant if politics shifted against her.
Above them all stood the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, a woman who understood the system better than anyone because she had survived it. Her authority was absolute within the harem. She approved punishments, arranged alliances, and quietly removed threats long before they became visible. She did not rule through emotion, she ruled through experience. She knew that mercy in this world was not kindness, it was weakness. Enforcing the system were the eunuchs, men stripped of lineage and future, turned into instruments of control. They watched every door, heard every conversation, tracked every movement. Their loyalty was not personal, it was institutional. They carried out punishments with the same calm they used to escort women to prayer. Drowning, exile, confinement, these were procedures, not crimes. The Bosporus was not a place of beauty to them, it was a solution. This was why accusations rarely mattered. Proof was unnecessary. Suspicion alone could destroy a life because the system valued certainty over justice. A woman did not need to be guilty to be dangerous. She only needed to exist at the wrong moment, in the wrong position, with the wrong attention upon her. And when danger appeared, the system responded swiftly, quietly, and permanently. By the time Isa and the others were led into the courtyard, they were not being punished for something they had done. They were being removed for what they represented: risk, uncertainty, disorder. The empire could tolerate cruelty. It could not tolerate doubt. And at the center of this machine, shaped by its rules and scarred by its methods, was a man who had learned its lessons too well. A ruler whose mind had been molded by confinement, fear, and survival. To understand what he became, you must understand where he learned that power meant eliminating threats before they spoke, because the system did not fail him, it created him.
The cage that taught him fear. Before he ruled others, he learned how to wait. Before he ordered silence, he lived inside it. Power did not free him, it finished what fear began. The place they called the cage was beautiful by design, and that was its cruelty. Painted ceilings glimmered with blues and golds, windows filtered daylight into soft patterns, and silk cushions lined the walls as if comfort could disguise captivity. From the outside, it looked like a privileged apartment inside the palace. From the inside, it was a waiting room for death. Princes entered as children and learned early that survival depended on obedience, stillness, and luck. The door opened rarely, and when it did, it was never safe to assume why. Ibrahim entered the cage before he understood what it meant. He was a boy when the guards closed the door behind him, too young to grasp that his childhood had ended, not because of wrongdoing, but because of blood. In this world, being born into the wrong order was a crime punishable by strangulation. He knew the stories. Every prince did. Brothers murdered brothers, not out of hatred, but necessity. The empire had taught itself that killing family was cleaner than risking civil war, and the cage was meant to be an improvement. Days inside blurred into years. Tutors came and went. Servants watched every movement. Eunuchs stood outside the single entrance, silent and unmoving, reminders that freedom was theoretical. Ibrahim ate well, slept on silk, and lacked nothing except certainty. Each morning he woke not knowing whether he would live through the day. Each night he slept with the knowledge that a change of mind, a rumor, or a political shift could bring executioners to his door without warning. He heard footsteps in the corridor often. Sometimes they passed by. Sometimes they stopped elsewhere.
Sometimes screams echoed faintly through stone, cut short with terrifying efficiency. Ibrahim learned to count the sounds, to memorize patterns, to listen for the pause that meant someone else's fate had been sealed. Over time, fear stopped arriving in waves and became constant, a pressure that reshaped thought itself. He spoke to walls. He avoided mirrors. He fed coins to fish, simply to watch something else move freely. One by one, his brothers disappeared. Each death narrowed the future until only two possibilities remained: the throne or the grave. By then, Ibrahim no longer trusted the idea of freedom. When guards finally came to tell him his brother was dead and the empire was his, he did not celebrate. He barricaded the door. He assumed it was a trick, the final deception before the cord tightened around his throat. It took proof, a corpse laid before him, before he would believe the cage had opened for any reason other than execution. 17 years inside a controlled environment teaches lessons that do not fade when walls are removed. Ibrahim emerged with absolute power and no tolerance for uncertainty. He had learned that safety came from control, that threats appeared without warning, and that hesitation invited death. Compassion had never protected him. Paranoia had. The system that spared him
also broke him, training his mind to see danger everywhere and mercy nowhere. When he took the throne, the empire saw extravagance and instability. What it did not see was a man replicating the only structure he understood. The harem became a reflection of the cage, controlled, monitored, sealed from the world, filled with people whose survival depended entirely on his favor. He did not invent its cruelty, he intensified it. Because to Ibrahim, uncertainty was lethal, and eliminating it felt like survival. This was why suspicion mattered more than truth, why accusation did not require evidence, why one whisper could doom hundreds. The man who had lived waiting for execution had learned a single terrible certainty. It was better to destroy imagined enemies than to wait and see if they were real. And once that belief took hold, no one inside the palace was ever truly safe.
The women who played for survival. Inside the palace, love was never free. Power passed through whispers, not crowns, and every victory carried the shadow of death. The harem was often described as a world of leisure, but those who lived inside it understood it as a battlefield disguised in silk. There were no swords, no open rebellions, only careful words and calculated silences. Every woman knew the rules, even if she never spoke them aloud. Survival depended not on kindness, but on awareness. A smile could be misread, a glance could be reported. Even grief, if shown too openly, could be taken as weakness. For those who caught the Sultan's attention, life changed instantly. Private apartments replaced shared dormitories, servants bowed, gifts arrived daily. Yet privilege brought exposure, and exposure was dangerous. Favor meant visibility, and visibility invited rivals. The women closest to power were watched, not only by the eunuchs, but by each other, measuring every movement for signs of weakness or opportunity. Alliances formed quietly and collapsed just as fast. Motherhood was the most dangerous role of all. Bearing a child could elevate a woman beyond imagination, but it also made her a target. Sons meant claims, claims meant fear. A woman with a child lived knowing that her fate was tied not to her own actions, but to political shifts beyond her control. If her son lost favor, she lost everything. If he rose too quickly, she attracted enemies willing to remove both of them to protect their own futures. Some women learned to wield influence without giving birth. They offered comfort instead of heirs, counsel instead of affection. These women understood the Sultan's fears better than anyone, because they listened when others spoke too much. They knew when to soothe and when to provoke, when to disappear and when to appear indispensable. In a system that rewarded obedience, manipulation became intelligence. Survival required adaptation.
Yet even the most careful players were never fully safe. The system encouraged competition, but punished certainty. A woman could do everything correctly and still vanish overnight. A rumor planted without proof could undo years of careful positioning. The eunuchs did not need justification. Orders were enough. Punishment did not imply guilt. It implied inconvenience. Above the daily struggles stood the Valide Sultan, watching the shifting alliances with practiced calm. She had once played the same game, and she had survived it by understanding its limits. She knew that unchecked influence within the harem threatened the empire itself. Women who gained too much power disrupted the balance that kept the dynasty intact. When that happened, intervention was swift and absolute. Removal was framed as necessity, not cruelty. As Ibrahim's reign continued, tension thickened inside the palace. His moods were unpredictable, his attention scattered. Women who had once felt secure found themselves suddenly scrutinized. Investigations began quietly, questions asked without answers expected. No one knew what had triggered them. No one knew how far they would go. Fear spread faster than information, turning the harem inward on itself. The system thrived on that fear. It encouraged self-policing, suspicion, and silence. Women began watching each other more closely than the guards did. Every conversation felt dangerous. Every night carried the possibility of being summoned, not for favor, but for removal. The palace, once designed to contain power, became saturated with it, unstable and volatile. By the time the decision was made, it felt inevitable to those who had lived long enough to recognize the signs. The system was no longer correcting itself, it was purging, and when fear reaches that stage, it no longer distinguishes between guilty and innocent. It only asks one question: who might be dangerous tomorrow? That was the question echoing through the corridors on the night the women were gathered. And it was a question that would soon be answered in the coldest way the empire knew.
The night the water was chosen. No trial was announced. No names were read aloud. The sentence arrived fully formed. The decision did not come with anger or spectacle. It came quietly, as most irreversible things do. Orders moved through the palace in whispers, carried by men trained not to question them. Preparations began hours before the women were awakened, because this was not an act of impulse. Canvas was brought in and stacked with care. Rope was measured and coiled. Stones were selected from the riverbanks, smooth enough not to tear the sacks, heavy enough to ensure they would never resurface. Each detail was handled with the calm efficiency of a ritual performed many times before. When the women were led into the courtyard, the scale of what awaited them became impossible to ignore. This was not the punishment of one accused individual, it was a cleansing. The system had decided that uncertainty itself was the crime, and uncertainty could not be interrogated or reasoned with, it could only be removed. The youngest women did not understand at first. They looked around in confusion, searching faces for reassurance that never came. Those who had lived longer inside the palace recognized the signs immediately. They had seen the sacks used before. Never like this, never this many. The chief eunuch moved first, not because he was eager, but because hesitation was forbidden. He selected a woman at random, her status irrelevant now, and guided her toward a sack. There was no announcement, no explanation offered to her or to the others. Words were unnecessary. The act itself carried the message. As the needle passed through canvas, as thread tightened and sealed the opening, the courtyard filled with sounds that would not be recorded. Breath, fabric, the low murmur of disbelief turning into panic. Some women resisted. Some went limp. Others stared straight ahead, holding themselves with a dignity that felt almost defiant. There was no pattern to courage in that moment. There was only the instinct to remain human as long as possible. Stones were added last, placed with practiced care to distribute weight evenly. The sacks grew heavy, misshapen, unmistakably final.
The procession moved toward the terrace overlooking the Bosphorus, the dark water reflecting torchlight like broken glass. The strait had always been part of the palace's punishment system, its depth and current perfect for erasing evidence. Bodies did not linger. Memory did not linger. The empire had relied on that silence for generations. Tonight, it would rely on it again. One by one, the sacks were lifted, swung forward, and released. There were no dramatic cries echoing across the water, no last speeches, no moments of mercy. The sound was dull, final, swallowed immediately by the current. Each splash marked the disappearance of a life that history would never count. Each absence made the next one easier. This was how mass violence survived inside orderly systems. It learned to feel routine. Those waiting their turn watched the number of sacks diminish and understood that nothing they said or did would change the outcome. Some closed their eyes. Some whispered prayers in languages they had not spoken in years. Some thought of homes they barely remembered, faces that had faded long before this night. The palace lights burned steadily, indifferent to the loss occurring beneath them. By the time the final sack disappeared beneath the surface, the courtyard was almost empty. The eunuchs cleaned the area methodically, removing rope, thread, and any trace of preparation. By morning, nothing would suggest what had happened there. The women who remained would wake to silence and assume the absences were transfers, punishments, or illness. That assumption was part of survival. The Sultan did not witness the event himself. He did not need to. The system functioned without his presence, exactly as it had been designed to do. What mattered was not his involvement, but his approval, and that approval had been given long before the first sack was sewn shut. What followed would be quieter, but no less consequential, because the water took the bodies, but it did not take the consequences, and the empire, having crossed a line it could not acknowledge, would soon be forced to confront what it had allowed in the name of order.
What the empire chose to forget. The water erased the bodies. The palace erased the memory. But silence has a cost that power cannot escape. Morning came to the palace as it always did, with light creeping across marble floors and servants resuming their routines as if nothing had changed. The courtyard was clean. The sacks were gone. The stones had returned to the river that had swallowed them. To the outside world, nothing had happened. There were no proclamations, no mourning rituals, no official records. The empire moved forward because it had learned that survival depended not on confronting horror, but on burying it beneath normality. Inside the harem, absence became the only evidence. Rooms stood empty. Familiar faces did not appear at meals or prayers. The women who remained understood without being told that questions were dangerous. They learned to speak names less often, then not at all. Grief, when it surfaced, was contained in private. To acknowledge the truth openly was to invite the same fate. Silence became not just obedience, but protection. Beyond the palace walls, the consequences began to ripple. Ibrahim's rule, already strained by extravagance and instability, grew increasingly isolated. Ministers whispered. The treasury weakened. The army lost confidence in leadership that seemed detached from reality. Even those who had tolerated cruelty in the name of order began to fear unpredictability. Empires could endure harsh rulers. They could not endure rulers who inspired uncertainty at every level. The man who had emerged from the cage, believing control meant safety, discovered too late that absolute control breeds resistance. His actions inside the palace did not secure loyalty, they eroded it. Those closest to him began to see not strength, but danger, not authority, but instability. In systems that depend on obedience, eventually turn on those who disrupt their balance.
Within a year, Ibrahim was deposed by the same machinery that had once protected him. The order was carried out quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. He was imprisoned again, returned to confinement by men who now viewed him as a liability. Not long after, he was executed in accordance with tradition, strangled without blood, his death framed as necessity rather than punishment. The empire moved on, relieved to close a chapter it preferred not to examine. History recorded his reign briefly, often dismissively, reducing complex suffering to labels of madness and excess. The women who died that night were not named. Their stories did not survive in chronicles or court records. They existed only in the gaps, in the silences historians later struggled to explain. Their erasure was complete because it had been intentional. Yet archaeology, foreign accounts, and fragmented records reveal enough to understand what happened, not as an isolated act of cruelty, but as the inevitable outcome of a system that rewarded fear, suppressed accountability, and treated human lives as expendable safeguards for power.
The horror was not that one ruler made a monstrous choice, it was that the choice fit seamlessly into an existing structure. This is why history stayed quiet, because acknowledging the truth would require admitting that order was built on suffering, that stability demanded sacrifice from those without voices, and that obedience was enforced not through justice, but through terror. The empire survived, but at a cost it never calculated. When we look back, it is tempting to frame the story as an aberration, a warning about one broken man. But that explanation is comforting, and comfort is rarely honest. What happened inside that palace was possible because ordinary people followed rules, because systems were allowed to operate without scrutiny, and because silence was rewarded. The water carried the bodies away, but it did not carry away responsibility. That remains, waiting in the spaces where history grows quiet, asking whether forgetting is ever truly the same as surviving.